Welcome to Native Bidaské, Native News Online's weekly spotlight on the people making news and leading change in Indian country.
Welcome to another episode of Native Bidaské. I'm Levi Rickert, your host. I'm founder, editor of Native News Online. And last week, a report from the Brookings was released about Indian boarding schools and education kind of in general in the Indian country. It was released on actually November 21st. We did a story on it. And what we wanted to do was bring on one of the co-authors of the report so you get a better understanding of what the report's about. And we're going to talk. And with me today, we have joining us is Rob Maxim, a fellow at Brookings Metro. And he co-authored it. And he is a tribal citizen of the Mashpee Wampanoag Tribe up in Massachusetts. Welcome to Native Bidaské, Rob. How are you doing today?
Levi. Good evening, Levi. Katapatash, thank you so much for having me on. I'm doing really well.
Well, and first of all, before we get going, I'm impressed that we have a Native brother over there at Brookings. Tell me about what you do over there. You're as a fellow, yes.
Yeah, currently one of two Native folks actually at Brookings. We have a Native intern as well, so it's good to have a couple folks in the building here. I do a couple things. So my background, I'm actually a trade economist originally by training, did international trade work. And when I came to Brookings, worked a lot with trade affected and economically distressed communities. Being Native, a lot of Native communities as well share some of the same challenges as economically distressed places. And so I've always focused on place-based economic work, and I've always said that Indigenous people and Native people are the most place-based. The idea of indigeneity is to be rooted in place, right? And our rights are full autonomy is prescribed in a lot of cases by place. So now I lead a lot of our work around tribal economies, and I think a lot about the role of identity in Indian country in particular. We're beyond, and we can talk about this, right? We're not just a race, we are a political group of political citizens in sovereign nations, and that has a lot of policy effects. So I think a lot about those issues, and in particular how they relate to education, the economy, and overall well-being in Indian country.
Well, and what prompted you to get involved with creating this report on Indian boarding schools and really overall the educational experience for Native Americans? I loved your report. I thought it was pretty thorough, albeit it was not a book, it was a report. But what got you, how does that relate to what you do there at Brookings?
Yeah, well, just on a personal note, I, like a lot of folks in Indian country, am a descendant of a boarding school survivor. Actually, over the Thanksgiving holiday, our local newspaper at home, the Cape Cod Times, did a piece reflecting on the boarding schools and Wampanoag people in it, and they highlighted my great-great-grandmother, Lizetta Tinkpocknet. She passed before I was born, but my dad was quite close with her. And she attended the Carlisle Indian School down in Pennsylvania. And the story there, we had a kind of a family story growing up that she had fled the school and somehow, as a Native woman in 1907, managed to navigate from rural Pennsylvania back up to Cape Cod, Massachusetts. This is like before the widespread, use of cars. She's an 18-year-old Native woman traveling alone. So we always had this family story, and then they digitized the records for the Carlisle School. You can look up her records, and sure enough, name Lizetta Pocknet, nation Mashpee, age upon entry, age upon leaving, and then status is listed as deserter. So it turned out that family history was quite true and confirmed by the records. So I've always thought about the boarding schools and how they've influenced Native people. Growing up, even into high school, a lot of my friends who were non-Native hadn't heard about this period in history. And, I often felt like I was like the only person in the room that knew about this major part of American history. And we weren't being taught it in school. So that really influenced my thinking from an early age, like I think a lot of folks in Indian country. And then, earlier this year, the Secretary of the Interior put out this two-part report on the legacy of the boarding schools and the first kind of federal investigative report. And when President Biden issued his official apology, I thought that, we at Brookings need to do something from our end to talk about the legacy of these schools, but then the modern policy outcomes as well.
Yeah, and I appreciate your summary on the Indian boarding schools. And we at Native News Online, we attended every single Road to Healing listening session on the tour that Secretary Haaland and Assistant Secretary Newland offered, and it was around the country. And so I'm really proud of that. So whenever you first sent me the report, I was really intrigued. I immediately opened it and started reading it because it's something that we are very, very interested here at Native News Online. Our viewers know that. And the president's apology, albeit some people have accused the president of making it political. It happened 2 weeks before. And then I've already said this on Native Bidaské, but Deb Parker from the National Native American Indians Boarding Schools Coalition up in Minneapolis made mention that the president had already made up his mind to offer this apology, but due to scheduling, there were 2 times previous that did not happen this year. So I do want people to know that it was not a political. And I was actually on NPR, and they asked me, did I think it was political or did I care? And I said, I don't care. He offered the apology, and that's the first time ever it's been done by a U.S. president. So
I think it almost would have felt like less impactful if he had waited till after the election. That's
correct.
My view. If we were, it would like no one would be paying attention. Mm-hmm. It wouldn't have made news in the same way.
Yeah, people aren't watching the news now, they tell me, because of the election. But to the point of the president, and he made mention of the physical, emotional, sexual abuse that our kids, Native kids, it's some of our ancestors. My grandmother went to Indian boarding school, so it's in your report you mentioned how it addresses most schools in the country don't teach Native American history. Okay, after 1900 and the results of misinformed public. Hey, Rob, what can be done to correct this?
Yeah, I think there are a couple examples of places that are already doing this. And it's interesting because in a lot of cases, they're bipartisan examples, which to me is one of the encouraging things about what could happen over the next few years. But one example is the growing number of states that are trying to pass Indian Education for All Acts or Indigenous Education for All Acts. And the first one actually came out of Montana, which is a purple, some would say growing, increasingly red state, but a really significant Native population there. And back in the late 90s, they passed a law talking about the need for all students to learn a full array of Native and Indigenous history. And now other states are kind of building on that model. A couple of years ago, Minnesota passed a more updated Indigenous Education for All Act. And so I think that's a perfect example of the type of policy that can be done to enhance the knowledge of Native history, not only for non-Native students, but for Native students as well, who often don't see themselves reflected in their classrooms. The challenge right now, in my mind, is there are a lot of states that are going in the opposite direction. They're passing bills where, they're banning what they often call, and I'll put this in quotes, right, like divisive concepts. And that's used to really, ban the teaching about anything that they don't like as a political agenda, regardless of how factual or accurate it is historically. And so I think that's a real challenge right now. And I worry that effort to kind of ban these really important fact-based historical ideas is going to pick up steam in the coming years.
Yeah, I think this anti-woke, and I like to put in there so-called woke because I'll say I've been awake for a long time, and so make a joke out of it. But there's such pushback by certain groups, and certainly this administration, or anyone who's read Project 2025 realizes that exactly what you just said, Rob. Anything that they don't agree with can be brought into question, and books banned, and courses cannot be taught. Teachers can't say certain things. We don't want anyone to feel guilty. Why is it really important, though, for people to know the truth when it comes to history?
Well, look, I'll say before we kind of dive into that, we've seen that even among Wampanoag folks. There was just a major kind of local story of an Aquinnah Wampanoag woman, Linda Coombs, wrote a book about colonization and the Wampanoag story. It's a children's book. The state of Texas just required that it be classified as fiction. And it's like, okay, it's not like, it's the Wampanoag perspective on our own history, right? And I think from our view, the real history really hasn't been taught in schools, which is why there are still like pilgrim plays, for example, which is a major source of stress and consternation for our tribe. So why is it important for folks to know history? I mean, for a couple of reasons, right? I mean, first is it really shapes the attitudes that folks have, and that in turn shapes what policy looks like in the U.S. So, one example that I use right now is this, the need to understand that Native Americans aren't just a racial group, we're a political classification, we're sovereign nations. If you're not teaching that we're sovereign nations that predate the U.S., we're nations that the federal government has treaties with, and those treaties are very much the law of the land in the same way that the First or Second Amendment still are, right? Like no one will question those about whether they're still good, even though they were, from 1789, right? If we're not teaching that type of history, then it leads to really perverse outcomes, and you see that, for example, in things like the Indian Child Welfare Act, where you had Supreme Court justices completely unironically talking about how ICWA was a racial preference for Native people. It's not. It's based in the treaties and the relationship, the government-to-government relationship that the U.S. has with tribes. And so when you have bad history getting taught in schools or no history getting taught in schools, it allows these inaccurate ideas to continue flourishing, and that has so many negative, follow-on effects for policy and for the way that we have to navigate, life on a day-to-day basis.
So Brookings is one of the. I want to use the word charge, but that may not be the right word. But one of the things you try to accomplish there is really get the truth out, isn't it? I've been a follower of Brookings for a long time, and I really appreciate some of the work the Institute has done. I mean, actually, they were one of the co-authors of the Merriam Report was from Brookings, right? So
that's right. Lewis Merriam was Brookings vice president at the time.
So you guys have a long history of hey, if you want to call it woke, go ahead, but just really just telling the truth, and I just think that's just so critical. So I appreciate your comments. Hey, given the new administration that I already mentioned, the 2025, what can we do to fight back? Or how can we push back?
I mean, I think raising awareness is so critical. One of the things that I worry about is that there's so much that happens I don't think this is a partisan statement to say in the last Trump administration, the news cycle, it was so chaotic so frequently, right? And it can burn folks out. So I think the idea of continuing to raise awareness about the ongoing challenges for Indian country is going to be huge. And it seems like, I think that there's folks probably have a worry right now that this is going to be something that is just totally set aside and there's kind of nothing we can do about it. And I think it's so important to continue talking about these issues for a couple of reasons. One, Congress ultimately at the end of the day is who is going to set policy for Indian country. The president has a huge role, but the plenary power, right, the role in setting policy is really in Congress. And so there are some really interesting leaders, bipartisan leaders in Congress that I think, are going to be important to engage in the coming years. For example, the House Appropriations Chairman, a Republican, likely to be Tom Cole, a Native American man. And so he has, he's a Republican, but he's taken an interest and has prioritized in a lot of cases issues affecting Indian country. And so, there may be opportunities to continue advancing, key policy initiatives for Indian country. And I think it's so important that we not just kind of throw our hands up and say, well, there's nothing we can do over the next 4 years. The other thing I've been talking about is I think one of the things the next 4 years is going to bring is a newfound opportunity for states to engage with tribes in new ways. Native tribes have historically engaged with the federal government because there's a clear legal trust and treaty obligation between the U.S. federal government and Native nations. The relationship with states is a lot more ambiguous. There are some states that have, some legal obligations through things like the public laws laid out during the termination era. There are others that don't, and that just have no role with the tribes that are within their borders. But you're seeing now some states choosing to voluntarily engage with tribes in really new and exciting ways. And I think there'll be a lot more opportunity for that over the next few years as well.
Yeah, I think to your point, when the ICWA was under attack or in the court system, the Brookings versus Haaland case, certain states set into motion protections for ICWA at state level. So to your point, it's a point well made. And I guess I can't encourage enough. And we, as a publisher of a Native News Online in Tribal Business News, which really we're in communications business. I'm always trying to figure out, Rob, how we can get that message out, how we promote that Native message a little more. And I just think that, plus, separate from Native Americans, how do we even get people in general just to pay attention to the news? And a non-Native, a friend of mine told me how his sister had not known that Donald Trump had told the House last year, and was it February or March, that don't do anything on immigration. Let it become a campaign issue. He may not have said it that way, but she was shocked. How did I not know that? Well, it's been in the news, but people just don't pay attention. Yeah. And so what's your thoughts on how we can really get the word out and get people to pay attention? And when I say that, I think tribal, to your point too about the states, tribal leaders need to pay attention at all levels of government, local, state, in government, even across tribal, working with the tribes to get that message out. Because if we don't safeguard what we have, we're going to lose a whole lot. That's my fear. So
I agree with that. We have a project going on right now with a couple regional organizations in California, thinking through how tribes and regional level government agencies can engage in new and innovative ways. So I absolutely agree with the need to engage with all levels of government. I think there's no one silver bullet for getting non-Native folks to care about issues in Indian country. If there was, we would have done that by now, right? This has been a challenge for as long as there's been, news and Native people, which is our whole country's history, right? One thing I will say is I think that there needs to be more efforts to get Native people into positions of, storytelling and news delivering and research and policy creation, right? And so that's why I'm really grateful to have this opportunity at Brookings to use the Brookings platform to talk about a lot of this stuff. The work that you're doing is incredible, and I think that the work that you're doing, there's a lot more that can be done by national publications, that places like the Times or the Post, who are kind of dipping their toes into these issues, but it's one of many things that they're reporting on. And one of the things I'd like to see is Native stories and Native news and Native political issues getting the attention that they deserve, given the importance that we play in the not only history of this nation, but like making up the modern lifeblood of the U.S. And I don't think that we get that currently, and I think a big part of that is because Native people tend to be even more significantly underrepresented in occupations like journalism and newsroom than they are in other places in the economy, and that's a major issue.
I would agree, and that's we actually are looking at Native news, and this time of year, being December, right? We are looking forward to what we're going to cover during 2025, the following year. that came up in discussion in some of our internal conversations, how we can incubate and get more people, Native American, become journalists and even maybe podcasters. People seem leaning in toward podcasting, and it's a kind of a challenge for us because obviously there's funding that has to be mean to just go do that. You just can't start these projects without any money. But I that's one of the things we want to lean into this coming year, and I think it is important that more of us are out there with the same message, chipping away. And I would love to see, quite frankly, some national organizations collaborate with the Native News Online's, Indian Country Today's, that are out there trying to. I jokingly say sometimes I feel like I'm a voice in the wilderness. I say that collectively for Native News Online, but we're out there, and even when it comes to that Indian boarding school issue, and you brought it up that a lot of people don't know about it, this issue, and we published 260 stories.
Wow.
And when you hear still that 90% don't know about it, hey, it's just like, man, what more can we do? What more can we do? Hey, I want to go to part of the report that you mentioned the new administration must fulfill the recommendations of the Federal Indian Boarding School and the Investigative Report Volume 2, which there were 8, and President Biden did fulfill the first one, and it was calling for the United States to apologize. That one's been done. We still have 7 left, right? What do you think we can do to encourage the incoming secretary and all probability Governor Doug Burgum from North Dakota? He actually has a nice working relationship with the tribes, from what I understand. What can we do to really ensure and really push him to, hey, Mr. Burgum, we need you, Mr. Secretary, we need you to fulfill these recommendations. What can be done?
Yeah, I mean, the good news is that he is coming from a state with a significant tribal population and has a working relationship with tribes. And I think that you see when people have firsthand relationships working with tribal communities and tribal governments, it becomes less of a partisan issue. So that, excites me. I'm hoping that he has the autonomy to be able to implement, a lot of these policy items. I think one of the challenges we face in Indian country is sometimes it seems like we almost have a choice between flying under the radar and not getting talked about at all, or we talk about and bring attention to the policy needs that we have, and there's like almost a backlash in some instances. You've seen that in Canada, for example, with some of the backlash to the dialogue around residential schools there. But what I think can be done is I think that tribal leaders need to continue talking with a unified voice around the importance of Interior to continue this work. I think they need to tell that directly to Interior. I think they also need to talk to, again, congressional members, because Congress is going to be the one that appropriates funding, that authorizes programs to do these follow-on steps. Interior, for as much power as they have, can't unilaterally do a lot of this stuff. They can do things like one of the recommendations was advancing international relationships. Yeah, I think there's opportunities for Interior to do that, but things like investing in present day remedies, a lot of that's going to have to go through Congress. Investing in further research, the funding to do these initial reports came from Congress. So I think that there's an important role that the Interior Secretary can play around his bully pulpit and continuing to choose to tell the story of these schools to advance relationships. And I think to do that, it's got to be a kind of a unified voice by tribal leaders, by Native serving organizations, Native leadership organizations like NCAI and others, to prioritize this. And I think it has been. I think you've seen a lot of tribes and Native serving organizations that have prioritized this work over many years. So I'm not concerned about that, but I think continuing to have that unified message of this is a priority and we're not just kind of giving up on this and letting it sit by the wayside is going to be really important.
And we have said here at Native News Online that during the Biden administration seemed to be this moment for Indian country, moment for tribal nations, we've never had this much attention in terms of even funding. People at high levels of government. The U.S. Treasurer was there. Deb Haaland, the first secretary in a presidential cabinet ever, who was Native American. Just phenomenal presence. And my understanding, there was like 80 to 90 Native Americans at high places in government throughout the last 4 years. And so kudos to President Biden. And what do you think, kind of in line with what we've been talking about? How do we keep this moment going? Would you agree with it? There's been a moment, but we don't want it to end, do we?
No, we don't. And I think a lot of that is it comes back to the funding that has come to Indian country, and the great opportunities that has provided for emerging things like economic development, tribal policy, investment in education, and others. And I think it's so important that the story about all of these investments and what's coming out of them be told. And I think that's a huge way to sustain momentum. There are really exciting, we talk about it in our piece, for example, right? Like places like Navajo Technical College that have received federal funding that are now doing like these really exciting new innovative efforts to embed their tribe with the kind of emerging semiconductor clusters that are being built around Phoenix. These visions of modern tribal economies that have come out of the work of the last 4 years and all the federal funding flowing through Indian country. And I think that those stories are so exciting because they disabuse the kind of stereotypical false story of Indian country kind of being like low income, not innovative, struggling. Like that's not the story in a lot of places. There's a lot of really exciting work going, and if you provide adequate funding and adequate resources, Native people will do a great job, and Native people will do really exciting new work, and Native people will craft emerging and cutting edge economies. And we need to start telling that story and pointing to the great work that's been done and say, keep investing in these places. If you want to do things like bring back American manufacturing, if that is a goal, right? If the goal is to build things here and create jobs here, Indian country has to be part of that, right? If you want to build new supply chains in the US, Indian country is going to be part of that. We are a key part in so many places of this emerging, US-led economic agenda that both parties are talking about. And I think it's so critical to center us in that story and point to the work that we're already doing there.
Rob, you put your economist hat on there. I love that.
Yeah, well, this is what I think about on a daily basis. So
that's great because that is the dollars spent for Indian country are money well spent. I mean, it's incredible. And I'll borrow from Jonathan Kozol, who's written a lot of books about the inequalities in America. Not Native, but I love reading Jonathan Kozol's work. And he one time I heard him in lecture say that the average American is like 1.5 paychecks away from being homeless. But when you bring the money, he says, kind of interesting what money does. Money does bring possibilities to turn. And you mentioned the Navajo Technical University, which we've covered many times.
Right, yeah.
They do phenomenal work. They really do in terms of producing the new generation of scholars and people can go out there and make it happen with technology. It's just wonderful. So, hey, Rob, I want to thank you so much. I'm going to have you back on. This has been great. You and I could talk for hours because
if we ever do a podcast, we can call my segment like Womp Wonk or something like that. Right?
That'd be great. Well,
we have a recurring segment there. Levi, Katapatesh, thank you again. Really enjoyed talking with you today, and thanks so much for your great work on the boarding schools and continuing to report on this. It's been hugely important, everything you've been doing.
Yeah, well, Chi-miigwech for your kind words. And to our viewers, thank you, Chi-miigwech, to you for tuning in to another episode of Native Bidaské. We've been talking to Rob Maxim from Brookings Metro, and they put out a report. And we'll, at the end of this, put the link where you can see that report. But go to that report, read it. He's done great work, and we're going to have him back on again. In the meantime, as I'd like to tell you, the young people, it's the holiday season. go hug your elders, take care of your elders, and take care of each other in Indian country. Chi-miigwech, we'll see you next week.
If you appreciate what we do here at Native News Online, we invite you to donate to support our continued work covering Indian country. You can scan this code with your smartphone or go to the link located below this video to donate today. We greatly appreciate your support. Please be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel and follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram. And be sure to scan this code or go to the link below to subscribe to our newsletter. Thank you for joining us today, and please be sure to join us again next week for another episode of Native Bidaské. Chi-miigwech.